In June 2019, the Center for Applied Earth Sciences and Engineering Research held a public meeting at the Hollywood Community Center in Memphis, Tennessee. CSER is a research institute at the University of Memphis, currently focusing on surface water and groundwater research. Memphis's drinking water comes from an underground system, the Memphis Sand Aquifer, or Memphis Aquifer, that was long thought to be geologically protected from contamination that might affect surface water. Recent studies have shown, however, there is connectivity between these layers, and that contamination can occur. Public meetings were scheduled because a small percentage of residents' utility bills paid to Memphis Light, Gas, and Water have been apportioned to fund this ongoing special research. The meeting at the Hollywood Community Center had a special relevance for people who live nearby. Their neighborhood borders some of the most notorious polluted sites in the region, including Tennessee's first Superfund site, the North Hollywood Dump.
I can remember when people would call the Hollywood Douglas area the country. The city grew up around it. There were rail yards there, trains, and there were a lot more factory jobs available at that time than there are now. A lot of those places have closed up.
The folks I talk to very often just kind of took it for granted that our neighborhood's going to smell, our neighborhood's going to get basically the bad end of the stick every time, just because that's what we do under segregation, or de facto segregation.
There was no big whoop-de-doo. It was just where we were blacks. Here was the demarcation line, as to say, and whites lived there. When you live in a community, you become a part of it. So, the odor and the stench, I lived through that.
At the time they were dumping there, it was called open pit dumping. And so you just, you go up and you dump a truck and all that stuff gets, dumped into the ground and you throw dirt over it, I guess at the end of the day or tomorrow, whenever. Velsicol dumped over there for a number of years, the whole time that the dump was there. And then after they closed the dump in '67, I believe, there were reports that Velsicol was continuing to dump even after that.
You had Vasical, you had Morel, you had the Stockyard, you had all of these entrances back through here. Buckeye, you had all of them. They were continuing to dump until they really got caught big time.
There were a couple people, Brother N.T. Green, that was a community activist that worked on this, and he enlisted, they had a task force, neighborhood task force, and Reverend Hubon Sandridge was the person that was the head of that committee.
And we dealt with the city of Memphis. And as time went along, you saw the trucks rolling in, and they were bringing the dirt in and taking the waste out. And so it really became a real issue for that North Memphis community and for the city of Memphis.
He was really good and was able to work with Brother Green to try and get attention.
Brother N.T. Green and Brother Green was very helpful. He was always playing the role of devil's advocate, and I was always the guy saying, let's try to get it done. So we needed him. We needed him to be loud and boisterous and make sure that the commission, when we go before them, you don't have but 3 minutes to speak, so we had to talk about how important it was to clean up the Hollywood dump.
There were various environmental studies done. There was a lot of activity. There were public meetings. There was just a lot going on around that time.
Dr. David Wilson, the chemist from Vanderbilt, he made it perfectly clear that the community is right. There is contamination on the Hollywood dump. And without him, we didn't have professional persons to say what they saw and what was going on.
Oddly enough, folks talk about Ronald Reagan, the big arch conservative. Ronald Reagan's administration passed the Superfund bill, CERCLA. That's the law, the Comprehensive Environmental Response and Liability Act, CERCLA. One of the most powerful environmental laws ever written, and the Superfund system is under CERCLA. And that was a law that sought to set up a mechanism to go out and find these contaminated places, hold the people accountable who created them as best you could, clean them up or just stabilize them. Cleaning up is in parentheses, but stabilize them and begin to do something other than just look at them and just bemoan them.
Sometimes it does come down to the community taking hold and taking ownership of what's going on. In that, sometimes the government is a lot bureaucratic and very slow. So taking things in our own hand has been the solution. And regenerating the soil has been the foundation of the process.
You see what we're doing here? We're trying to protect our soil. We got some of the richest soil in Sherry County. You tarp it down, and once you smother those weeds, you go back and then you get the roots out. Then you cover it back up, and then you make this layer of soil on top of that. That's how you go clean, healthy vegetables.
Right.
The reason why I asked the question, like I said, I don't recall you covering it, but so we're near Cypress Creek and all the contamination from the Vassar Powell property years ago, they're dumping into Cypress Creek. And
our community could improve, and it could be a functional community, just like so many communities right by us, because we're nowhere from the city zoo, we're nowhere from Rose College. All that is less than a mile from here. But yet our community, we get overlooked. We don't get that development, we don't get the attention. Our stuff is just covered up.
Very, very, very few contaminated sites can be completely wiped clean and made pristine. It just generally does not happen. So you're telling people the truth when you say, we've capped it, we've got monitoring wells, we've got pump and treat, which is where you actively pump. There's places that are pumping thousands of gallons of groundwater out that are contaminated. We're treating it and discharging the sewer system all day long, and they'll be doing that for the next 50 years. New things, it's injected into new plants, new dumps, that idea, are we disproportionately impacting a community of color or just a low-income community as opposed to another? That's forced into the NEPA process more now. It wasn't even a part of it before, so that has had the impact there. So that's a good thing, but again, it hasn't done much good for undoing the wrongs of the past. I don't know how you're going to do it.
I'm old. And so one of my fears is that somebody will come along one day and want to put housing on top of the Hollywood dump. And people like myself that would kick up a fuss have died and gone on. Maybe the records will be buried in whatever, city or county office, and nobody will know. But I really have a serious concern about that. I had someone call me, I want to say it was around 2015, call me at the office, and they were calling me from the Office of Planning and Development of the city. And they wanted to know if the Hollywood dump had been taken off of the Superfund site. The question was, has it been cleaned up? Is it ready for things like commercial development or housing? And I said, well, no. I said, you can't do that. And they says, well, we have a real estate developer that's been asking questions at our office about the Hollywood dump area, because there's a lot of acres over there. And when you pass it, it looks like a grassy field. And that's the danger of a lot of Superfund sites, is that they might look like a grassy field or a wooded area. And it's much more than that.
Look, I wish they would leave it alone, leave that stuff. Let it stay capped and, maybe the God of the universe will fix it, I don't want them to stir that up no more.
Thank you for joining us. The film we just watched was made primarily over the summer of 2019. One reason I haven't shown it before now, I was hoping to draw it to a clearer point, but the more I learned about the history of the dump and its cleanup, the more complicated the story became. So in this panel discussion, I'm going to be talking to some people who are involved in doing something or working on concrete solutions to the problem of legacy pollution in Memphis. And that panel is Brian Waldron, the director of CSER, Center for Applied Earth Sciences and Engineering Research, Scott Banbury of the Sierra Club, Jim Kovaric, executive director of Protect Our Aquifer, and Councilwoman Michael Easter Thomas of Memphis City Council District 7. Let me start with Brian Waldron. CSER is in some ways like a local version of the U.S. Geological Survey. You're assembling state-of-the-art data sets to make images that give us a more complete picture of our area. Everything from mapping tree cover or mapping a water basin to mapping street signs and sidewalk corner ramps. And of course, mapping the Memphis aquifer where we get our drinking water. In talking about that project, what have you learned in general about historical sites of contamination and their relationship to the aquifer?
Right. Well, appreciate you having me. What we have determined is that when we see localized contamination of our primary drinking water aquifer, the Memphis aquifer, it's not something that happened 2 weeks ago or a year ago. It is related to these legacy contamination sites back in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, that really before regulation was in place, we thought the solution to pollution was dilution, and we created landfills and dumped into the backyards of industries and ourselves. And those are the issues that we're seeing right now, these legacy contamination sites.
When you're studying the shape and structure of the aquifer, I know there's a lot of interesting work going on. How does this information you're assembling get turned into public policy?
The data that or the information that we map about the aquifer really looks at the potential of contamination to the Memphis aquifer and how it's getting there. And what we're able to do is share that information with elected officials and other government bodies that can either go back to those legacy contamination points and look to clean them up, or if they are being cleaned up, to better understand how that contamination may be moving off site. And then the protective clay that is over our drinking water supply, the Memphis aquifer, has these naturally occurring holes in it called breaches. And by providing information about where these breaches are, we can plan better activities on land, whether it's new construction or just current activities, to minimize future contamination of our groundwater.
Moving to Scott Banbury of the Sierra Club. Scott, as a longtime environmental activist, you know the story of the Hollywood dump better than I do. One of the things that struck me in putting this piece together is how many different stars had to align for anything to be done. You had citizens like Brother Green, and I wish I'd found out more about him. He seems like a fascinating personality. He was making a lot of noise with his concerns about environmental pollution in Memphis, and some of those concerns never played out into action, unlike Hollywood, which became an early Superfund site and was cleaned up in the way Larry Smith describes in the film. What can we do to get to a more methodical approach to these problems?
Well, thanks for having us, Bart, and thanks for the question. I think this is probably the most important question. Is, we unfortunately, we see public participation in these kind of decision-making processes only happen when it's in people's backyards. And key there is that if it's happening in somebody's backyard who has the wherewithal to inform themselves as to how the laws work, how the regulations work, and engage meaningfully. And that's just here and there. There's no real institution that helps people to maintain an ongoing effort here. That's one of the great hopes of the Protect Our Aquifer organization. It's also one of the things that CSER is moving to fill the blanks in. Of course, CSER doesn't really have the capacity to go out and teach people how to become effective environmental advocates. That becomes the Sierra Club's role. Unfortunately, we don't usually know that a problem is coming up until a permit's up for renewal or a land use decision is up that brings to light some past contamination like Brian was just talking about. And so, again, having an institution that is keeping things moving, keeping people educated and informed as to how to best handle these things is key. In Shelby County, much more so than any other place in Tennessee, we have groundwater rules and regulations on the books that bring the health department into considering these things. And part of our mission over the last 2-3 years has been to encourage the health department to be more proactive in their approach to these issues.
Has it helped to have an organization like CSER creating more precise images, more precise models of how the aquifer works?
Oh, absolutely. Brian is probably sick of us already because he is our first go-to guy. Anytime we learn about a potential threat to the aquifer, we're like, hey, Brian, what do you know about this? And so CSER, I mean, we're blessed to have CSER in the community. Of course, CSER, only gets to look at what they have resources to look at. And part of our job in the Sierra Club and the job of the Protect Our Aquifer organization is to make sure that more resources are available to institutions like CSER to, get this information together and make it available to folks that need it when they need it.
Well, let's talk about Protect the Aquifer, which is an organization that was founded several years ago, but this year has shifted into a long-term strategy. And Jim Kovaric is its new executive director. Jim, can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Of course, we started with a grand vision and a very specific focus, both just the aquifer and just in Shelby County, knowing full well that the aquifer is much bigger. Immediately, we were drawn into what we tend to think about is a whack-a-mole situation, where every time we would wake up, look in the paper, read some of these permits that would come across, people trying to do what they had done in the past that led to these polluted sites, such as putting landfills next to the Wolf River, putting sand and gravel mining areas in wetlands, and really poor care of the land. So, we started by looking at the laws and the ordinances and what do we have to protect ourselves that's on the books. And what we found is what's on the books and what's written is pretty good and it covers a lot of ground. But in reality, it's not being covered. And I'll give you one quick idea of that is the ordinance and the regulations have a line that says the groundwater board and the health department, one of their chores is to abate existing pollution. Well, they're not out looking at the pollution that exists already. They're not out working on that. They have different fish to fry. And so we find ourselves being drawn into those areas constantly. And it's made us thinking about recalibrating what we do and having it much broader in terms of how we accomplish what we're going to accomplish, which is protect our aquifer.
And I focused on the aquifer in this discussion because that's the part of the story that affects Memphis most broadly. But obviously the burden of past contamination is not equally shared. Councilwoman Easter Thomas, Hollywood the neighborhood is in your district, and it's been shaped by this legacy. What does that neighborhood need in 2020? Is it different from what other distressed neighborhoods in Memphis need?
So when we talk about distressed neighborhoods in the city of Memphis, there are a few similarities that we see across the board. You see industrial and environmental negative impact. You see Black people. You see health concerns and disparities. You see poverty. You see food deserts. You see bank deserts. You see a whole slew of issues that are all aligned together. As Scott kind of hinted to earlier, when he said a lot of things you don't pay attention to or pay any mind to if they're not in your backyard. And that does happen a lot of times in communities and in politics. It just so happens that Hollywood is my backyard. And I'm also a part of the political sphere locally here in Memphis. So in my particular community and where I stay, it was also formerly a dump in the city of Memphis. And how it has formed over the years, just in my particular neighborhood, has contributed to flooding, has contributed to water erosion along the creek. And that also plays in tandem when I think about my neighbors next door in Hollywood. And so as we think about what government has allowed to happen, because these natural events can't be controlled. However, government response and government allowance of how we let corporations and industries into our neighborhoods and amongst our people is what we can control. And as far as planning and zoning, I'm sure everyone on here knows that we can't go against anything that has already been done. You can't backtrack in planning and zoning. But what you can do is move forward knowing the mistakes that we've already made and where we've allowed certain things to happen in our Black neighborhoods in Memphis. And those, if you take the industry areas in South Memphis and these areas over here on Hollywood, as you go from Chelsea on up to Douglas, you would think you're in the same place.
One explanation I heard when I was researching this piece about why some of the cleanup that started in the 80s and 90s slowed down is that continuing publicity about a neighborhood's pollution issues might hamper its redevelopment or limit the investment that people would make in the community, that these problems needed to be played down. How do we get around that? I mean, how do we move forward for these neighborhoods?
Right. I think that if it's said to play down an issue, that's probably somebody saying that they're putting it on their own personal back burner. Because as we see, change doesn't happen unless things are placed in the forefront, unless things are forced to have a conversation, and unless people are innate to listen and actually act. So conversations need to be started again. And there are people, Protect the Aquifer, Sierra Club, Caesar. I was there when you all had your last year, when you all presented your findings at the Hollywood Community Center. That was a very well attended event. So getting back up these conversations and not letting up so that exposure and information is had. A lot of things is about how can people learn about what's going on. It's not that nobody cares. A lot of times it's about, well, who knows in order to care? So we have to make sure that we're keeping those conversations up, make sure we're talking to our representatives of the area and keeping them informed so that these viewpoints can be on the top of our minds when we're making decisions. When these new applications come in for certain areas, even if that area is zoned for XYZ, do we want to contribute and exacerbate the issues that we've seen for decades? So those are things that we have to keep in mind when making new decisions going forward, but they won't happen if we don't steadily keep these conversations going and being robust. So I applaud those who are steadily and consistently doing this work because it keeps these things on our representatives' minds. So if I was not to have Hollywood in my backyard, definitely keep it on my mind and on my radar so that we can make sure to ensure this for future generations.
Following on what Michaelyn said, I think we need to put a big fat star on every piece of contaminated ground in Shelby County and Memphis. And we need to begin to work on those pieces, and we need to clean up our own backyard. And in so doing, we could become a model for the entire US, world, you name it. One great idea that floats around out there, and Brian loves this one, and it's called the Freshwater Institute. I think we have to let science lead us, And then we have to bear down very carefully on places like the Hollywood dump, the Bolero area, other landfills, Wolf Boulevard landfill, and really grip the problems that we have and solve them here in Memphis and Shelby County. And that's the way to go forward. And that's one of the things that's high on our agenda. And we know that's going to take years and millions of dollars, but we've got to start now.
For my final question, I'm reflecting on something Rita Harris said. How do we establish a sustainable approach to managing sites like the Hollywood dump so that we don't forget? How do we keep from making the same mistakes? Scott Banbury.
Well, I kind of spoke to this already. We lack some institutional memory on a lot of these issues. As we've started talking about contamination issues in the North Memphis area around the aquifer, it's kind of like educating anew because things have been forgotten since the mid 90s, late 90s. And so having a repository for not only the data and information that Caesar keeps, but also having a repository of history of what we've faced here in Memphis and not making the same mistakes again, as Councilwoman Easter Thomas pointed out, is super important. We don't want to put more of the same challenges on the same communities. We want to be making very proactive decisions about recovering the values in those communities and reinvesting in them in a way that makes other people also want to reinvest in them.
Thanks. That's all we have time for. I wanted to thank the panelists for joining me and our viewers for watching. Good night.